Meccano, part number 1, 12.5-inch perforated strip. Hi folks and welcome back. It's an aeroplane build. They're like an old friend who just puts you at ease, or a mug of cocoa in front of the fire with hot buttered crumpets while reading a good book. And this week we're looking at the 13th of the aeroplane constructor set builds, the single-engined commercial biplane, but the title of the video might have given that away. The source aircraft, they state, is the de Havilland Giant Moth, which was a passenger aircraft from the 1920s. The time is a period of romance, the end of the Victorian period. The horror of the First World War is over, and at last we're entering into a period of enlightenment led by science and engineering. We would put the world to rights. Never again would suffering be allowed to raise its head. Science would solve it. And while this might seem naive, the 1920s saw two large famines that gripped Eastern Europe and Russia, stopped, albeit with great loss of life and anguish. The world had come together and said no in one voice, and it was solved. Penicillin was discovered in 1928, and Wilhelm Einthoven discovered how to measure the electrical currents of the heart that led to the breakthroughs in saving life. Insulin was recognised for controlling diabetes, and that at last the disease, which had been fatal up to that point, could be controlled. The controversial Rorschach test, or the ink blot test, was also created. Ask me what it looks like, it's all about tea. The future looked great. We built huge buildings of steel and concrete. Bridges spanned gaps that were deemed to be impossible to cross. And across the world, fledgling airlines took to the skies, flying in primitive-looking machines. You could cross the Atlantic in hours instead of days or weeks. Our heroes dashed to motorcars and aeroplanes to catch the fleeing villains. Superman, the first of our superheroes, was created. It might seem strange in today's world when we look back at the early airliners. De Havilland only built 10 Giant Moth airframes, whereas Boeing have built over 10,000 737s. And Airbus have built nearly as many A320s. And few airlines have the history like Queensland and Northern Territory aerial services, having been in the air for over 100 years. We know them better as Qantas, the Australian flag carriers. They started on the 16th of November 1920, flying an ex-First World War Avro 504. In the early 1920s, they moved onto the de Havilland DH-50 and carried mail, as well as up to 4 passengers. In 1928, the DH-61, known as the Giant Moth, replaced the DH-50 model and was snapped up by Qantas to assist the other airframes. It carried 50% more passengers for nearly twice the range, with an increased speed of nearly 30%. The aircraft was fitted with a new luxury, something that hadn't been heard of before in a Qantas aircraft: a toilet. There is a somewhat colourful history behind the aircraft lavatory. The first one was fitted in 1919 to a Handley Page Type W. In 1921, the Caproni CA-60 also had them fitted. The CA-60 was a 9-wing aircraft and was a test bed for Italy's transatlantic air service. It crashed on its second flight. Quite frankly, I'm amazed it made it to its second flight. The Supermarine Stranraer flying boat had a toilet that was vented to the open air, and when the lid was lifted in flight, the passage of air over the opening would lead to a whistling sound being made. The nickname for the aircraft was the Whistling Shithouse. The short Sunderland flying boat of Second World War fame had porcelain flush toilets fitted. But my heart goes out to the British and American bomber crews of the Second World War. They had a bucket with a lid on it, called airlines in British service. They had a habit of overflowing, and given the many layers of clothing worn by the crews to keep them warm, made it difficult to get undressed to use the toilet. Most crews preferred to urinate in bottles and poop in cardboard boxes, which they would then throw out of the aircraft. The other risk of the airlines was the need for pilots to take sudden and violent evasive manoeuvres with little to no warning, with unpleasant results for anybody using the toilet at the time. The Giant Moth doesn't have any great first flights to its name. By the time it had come into service, most of the firsts had already been achieved. But it served well for its intended role, that of a transport aircraft. The Daily Mail operated one, registration Golf Alpha 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 November, equipped with a motorbike and a dark room. The aircraft would land as close as possible to the news incident they were reporting on, get the shot and return to the office. The Daily Mail at the time was the cutting-edge newspaper when it came to technology. By the early part of the 20th century, they were the world's largest newspaper based on circulation. They were one of the first newspapers to have a female war correspondent, Sarah Wilson, who followed the Second Boer War in 1902. They were also the first newspaper in the UK to transport papers by train, therefore increasing their area of publication and also reducing the amount of printing press facilities they needed. At the beginning of April 1929, Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm set out from Sydney to fly to England in the Southern Cross, a Fokker F7 trimotor. Before they left Australian airspace, radio contact was lost, and a rescue mission to find them was mounted. Flying a Giant Moth named Canberra, Les Holden, a First World War flying ace, flew out with a crew of 3, a wireless operator LSW Stanage, Dr. G. Hamilton, and a ground crew engineer F.R. Mitchell, covering 9,000 miles and flying for over 100 hours, not all at once of course. They found the Southern Cross crashed on mud flats near the Gleneagh River. Keith Anderson and Bob Hitchcock, 2 other air search rescuers, lost their lives when their aircraft named Kookaburra crashed. At the time, the media turned on Smith and Ulm, claiming the crash to be a staged event to drum up media coverage for their flight to the UK, and the parties that had promised to cover the costs of the rescue refused to pay up. Holden, nicknamed Lucky Les the Homing Pigeon, who had been awarded the MC and the Air Force Cross for daring and very dangerous low-level ground attacks in the closing stages of the First World War, would go on to be one of the first recorded flights to New Guinea in September of 1931. In 1932, while on a fishing trip, he would be killed in a crash as a result of wing failure caused by aileron flutter. In Britain, a Giant Moth named Youth of Britain was flown by Sir Alan Cobham on a 21-week aviation promotional tour around the United Kingdom in 1929, covering 110 towns. Flying around 60,000 miles, he took over 40,000 passengers, including 10,000 children, on their first flight, nominally lasting around 15 minutes. The purpose of the tour was to encourage flight and the love of aviation with the general public. One such person was 10-year-old Eric Stanley Locke. 10 years later, now Flight Lieutenant Locke was flying Spitfires in the RAF. During the Battle of Britain, he is credited with being the RAF's most successful pilot, shooting down 21 enemy aircraft and earning the nickname Sawn-Off. In true British banter, this was down to his short height and not his fighting abilities. Locke was returning from a rhubarb mission on the 3rd of August 1941 when he flew past a column of German troops and vehicles on a road. Peeling off from his flight as they returned to Britain, he was seen lining up to make a strafing ground attack. It was the last time he was ever seen, and even though a number of searches have been made where it is believed he was shot down, no remains of either his aircraft or himself have ever been found. Locke was the first of the high-scoring RAF aces to be shot down. 6 days later, Douglas Bader would also be shot down, albeit by the available evidence, to friendly fire. For those of you that want to know, rhubarb missions were ground attack missions flown in bad weather at murderously low altitude, seeking targets of opportunity such as trains, columns of troops or vehicles, and airbase attacks where the aircraft were grounded due to the bad weather. The reason that Locke had joined the RAF and become a pilot was not, as one might assume, down to that flight 10 years earlier. In fact, he'd been unimpressed by the event. He just didn't want to join the Army or the Navy, so applied to be a pilot instead. So here we are, the end of the build, and if you haven't spotted it already, I made a mistake and didn't see it until I'd finished filming, including looking at the model when I filmed the What's on the Bench video. And the mistake? Starboard wing front strut. It's back to front.